The farm gate creaked as Clara pushed the old wood with the hand not holding her suitcase. The sun was almost touching the rolling hills, bathing the dirt yard of a tired-looking farmhouse in orange light, just like the man standing on the porch. Thomas held a baby in his arms, crying softly, with that cry of someone too weary to ask for anything more. And beside him, a girl of about 6 years old looked at the stranger with eyes too hard for a child. The kitchen was dark, the wood stove cold, and the smell coming from that house wasn't of food, it was of abandonment. It was then, seeing that strong man brought to his knees from within, that Clara took a deep breath and spoke the words that would change everyone's destiny. "If you let me stay, I can make supper." And what seemed like just a hungry girl's plea, my friends, became one of the most beautiful stories these country roads have carried on the wind. If you believe that God sometimes places the right person in our path just when hope is fading, leave your like now. Subscribe here to the Tales of Other Times channel. Activate the bell so you don't miss any story, and tell me in the comments from what corner of the world you're listening. Let's begin. In country villages. In other times, stories like these were told between rivers and dirt roads. The lane that cut through that piece of land had no name on maps, because maps didn't bother with places the world seemed to have forgotten. It was a wide, red dirt track, squeezed between round hills covered in dry grass, and hardly anyone was seen on it at that hour. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and the silence was broken only by the mournful coo of a hidden mourning dove in some thicket. Clara had been walking that road for almost 3 days, stopping by the creeks to drink water and sleeping under trees when night fell. The small leather suitcase bumped against her leg with every step, and inside it was little that the world would consider valuable, but everything Clara truly possessed: a change of clothes, a bone comb from her mother, and a hardcover notebook where her mother's tiny script recorded recipes that came from far away, from grandmother to daughter, from daughter to granddaughter. Clara was 22 years old, but she carried in her body and soul the weight of someone who had already lived too many lives in too little time. Her father, a logger by trade and a wanderer by nature, died in a logging accident when she was still a child, leaving behind only debts and the warm nostalgia of a man who spent more time on the road than at home. Her mother, a laundrywoman with chapped hands and a gentle heart, held on firmly for 2 more years, until tuberculosis did what sadness hadn't managed. Clara was left alone at 16 and was taken in by a great-aunt named Margaret, who lived in a rented room at the back of a boarding house and made a living with small sewing jobs. Aunt Margaret was outwardly rigid, but she had a quiet affection that showed in her gestures, and it was she who taught Clara to turn little into much in a kitchen, to stretch a handful of flour into food for 3 days, to make a beef bone into a broth that could revive even the sick. Clara cared for Aunt Margaret for 5 years, watching her slowly fade like a candle burning down without haste. When her aunt's heart finally rested on a March morning, Clara realized she had no one else in the world. The owner of the room appeared before the funeral to ask when she would vacate. There was no inheritance, no distant relative, no man waiting. There was only the road and the stubborn hope that somewhere, a girl who knew how to work would be needed. She gathered what little she had in her suitcase. She tucked her mother's recipe notebook among her clothes like a sacred relic and left without looking back, because looking back was a luxury that people without a home couldn't afford. The farmhouse appeared at the end of that afternoon like a mirage in the middle of nowhere. Clara almost didn't believe it when she saw the wooden farm gate, the wide dirt yard, the house with white walls and a shingled roof, the corral with some lean cows, and a chicken coop where hens pecked aimlessly. It wasn't a rich place, but it was a place of people, and people meant the possibility of a plate of food and a corner to sleep. She stopped at the edge of the road. She tidied her braid, which the wind had partly undone. She brushed the dust from her light dress, which was no longer so light after 3 days of walking, and took a deep breath before pushing open the gate. The creak of the wood echoed through the yard and was enough to draw the attention of whoever was there. The first thing Clara saw was the girl. She was sitting on a low stool near the chicken coop, peeling potatoes with a seriousness that didn't suit any child, for it was the expression of one who had learned that the world is not a safe place. She had brown hair cut to her chin, a simple dress of worn fabric, and a gaze that measured the stranger from head to toe, without speaking, without gesturing, without smiling. Clara was about to open her mouth to speak when she heard the crying. It came from inside the house, a soft cry from a baby who had worn out its voice from crying so much. And along with it, the man appeared. Thomas emerged from the doorway like someone leaving an endless battle. He was tall, with broad shoulders and enormous hands, like someone who had worked the land since memory began. but everything about him screamed exhaustion. His beard hadn't been shaved in days. His wrinkled linen shirt had a milk stain on his shoulder, and his sunken eyes carried the kind of exhaustion that isn't cured by a night's sleep, because it wasn't just his body that was worn out. In his left arm, he held a baby of about 7 or 8 months, wrapped in a blanket that had seen better days, and the child wriggled and whimpered with the restlessness of one who needs something the father doesn't know how to give. Thomas looked at Clara with surprise and something akin to distrust, because in those times, a woman alone on the road raised questions. Clara swallowed her nervousness and spoke in the firmest voice she could muster, apologizing for the bother and saying she just wanted a glass of water before continuing her journey. Thomas descended the 2 steps of the porch carefully, balancing the baby who wouldn't stop moving, and replied that there was water, but she would have to come in and help herself, because he couldn't let go of the child. Clara thanked him and walked towards the house, passing the girl who remained seated on the stool, following the stranger's every step with those watchful eyes. When Clara entered the kitchen, what she saw tightened her heart in a way she recognized, for it was the same sad disorder she had seen in Aunt Margaret's house in her last months. When the old woman could no longer keep things tidy, the wood stove was cold with days of accumulated ash. Dirty pots were piled in the stone sink, remnants of dry food stuck to the table. There was no sign of supper being prepared, no smell of stew on the fire, no bread cooling under a cloth. She looked at the clay pot in the corner, poured herself water, and drank slowly, thinking. Then she looked again at the kitchen, the pots, the dead stove, the window through which she saw Thomas in the yard, trying to calm the baby unsuccessfully, while the girl resumed peeling potatoes with mechanical movements. Clara thought of the road that awaited her outside, of uncertain towns, of doors that might open or not, and she thought of that house that needed someone, in the same way she needed a place. The decision formed before reason could argue. She left the kitchen, went to the porch where Thomas had sat with the baby, and spoke plainly, without asking permission of her own courage. "Mr. Thomas, I saw that the stove is cold and the children haven't had supper. If you let me stay, I can make supper. And if you like the supper, we'll talk about the rest later." Thomas looked at the girl with the undone braid and dusty dress, who had appeared out of nowhere, offering food like someone offering salvation, and felt a mix of astonishment and distrust, warring with the exhaustion he could no longer bear. He should say no, he should politely thank her, and tell the girl to continue on her way. But the baby was crying in his arm. His daughter was outside peeling potatoes alone, like a miniature old woman, and it had been 3 days since any of them had eaten a real meal. The shame of admitting he couldn't cope weighed less than his children's hunger. He nodded briefly, and Clara didn't wait for him to change his mind. She entered the kitchen as if entering a work field, rolled up the sleeves of her dress, and started with the stove. She cleaned out the old ash, arranged the firewood piled in the corner, and with the skill of someone who had done it all her life, lit the fire on the first try. While the flames gained strength, she rummaged in the pantry and found soaked beans that no one had cooked, a piece of bacon, cornmeal, some eggs, and the potatoes the girl was peeling outside. It wasn't much, but Clara had learned from her mother that cooking isn't about abundance, it's about knowing how. In less than an hour, that farmhouse kitchen smelled of real food for the first time in many months. The beans bubbled thickly in the iron pot, the cooked potatoes steamed on a platter, the fried eggs gleamed in the black skillet, and the aroma spread throughout the entire house like a living presence, pushing sadness out of every corner. The girl was the first to appear in the kitchen doorway, drawn by the smell like a wild animal sniffing out food. She stood there, watching Clara with that mixture of hunger and distrust that broke the heart. Clara didn't force conversation. She simply set the table with what she found, placed 3 plates, and served the food in silence, as if she did this every day, as if she had always belonged in that kitchen. Thomas entered with the baby in his arm, stopped at the door, and stood looking at the set table with an expression Clara couldn't read, but which seemed like pain mixed with something else. He sat down slowly, settled the child on his lap, and looked at the plate as if he couldn't believe it was real. They ate almost in silence. The girl, whom Clara would discover was named Lily, ate everything on her plate and kept looking towards the pot with a hunger that wasn't just for food. Clara served more without asking, and the girl accepted without thanking, but ate every bite with an attentiveness that spoke more than any words. Thomas ate slowly, chewing carefully, and Clara realized he was fighting against something inside himself, against an emotion that men of that time and place didn't allow themselves to show. The baby, who had calmed with the warmth of the kitchen and the smell of food, fell asleep on his father's lap, with his mouth slightly open. And when supper ended and silence settled in that warm kitchen, Thomas looked at Clara and simply said that the back room was empty and she could stay that night, and they would talk in the morning. Clara thanked him with a gesture and collected the plates. She washed everything in silence, while Thomas took the children to their rooms. And when she was alone in the kitchen, she listened to the sounds of the farmhouse settling in for the night. The distant moo of cattle, the wind in the garden trees, the crackling of the last embers in the stove. Before going to the little room, her eyes paused on a photograph hanging on the living room wall between a wooden crucifix and a dried sprig of sage. It was a portrait of a young woman with light eyes and dark hair, with a serene smile that seemed to bless the entire house. Clara looked at that face and felt something strange stir within her chest, a feeling that wasn't sadness or joy, but something she couldn't yet name. She quickly averted her gaze and went to the room, where she lay down on the narrow bed with a thin mattress and closed her eyes, listening to the breathing of the house around her. That night, for the first time in weeks, no one cried in that farmhouse, neither the baby, nor the girl, nor the man. And Clara, who had nowhere to turn that morning, fell asleep feeling that perhaps, just perhaps, that cold stove had been waiting for her. The sun was still sleeping behind the hills when Clara opened her eyes that first morning. Her body ached from the journey, but her mind was already awake before the rest. Because the mind of a woman who needs to prove her worth doesn't rest well. She got up, put on the same dress she had washed the night before, and hung in the window, and walked barefoot down the dark hallway to the kitchen. Everything was as she had left it, clean and tidy, and the silence of the house was the kind that makes one hear even their own heart beating. Clara lit the stove in the dark, by practice, by touch, by the instinct that years of cooking had etched into her hands. And when the first flames illuminated the whitewashed walls, she felt she was doing the right thing. She put water to boil, found a handful of roasted coffee in a tin can, ground it in the mill, and slowly brewed it, letting the strong aroma take over every corner like a silent invitation. Thomas appeared at the kitchen door before the coffee was ready, with the baby draped over his arm and the expression of someone who hadn't slept enough, but had grown accustomed to it. He stood for a moment, watching Clara move around the kitchen as if she knew every corner, every pot, every spoon, and something in that scene made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't a bad discomfort. It was the discomfort of seeing someone occupy a space that had been empty for too long, like when one opens a window after months of being shut and the light streams brightly into the eyes. Clara noticed his presence and offered him coffee without ceremony, already preparing a cup of warm milk for the baby, with the care of one who knows that a small child needs nourishment in just the right measure. Thomas accepted the coffee and sat at the table, unsure what to say, because morning conversation wasn't a habit he had kept after Sarah was gone. It was there, over that first morning coffee, that the two sealed their agreement, without needing many words. Thomas said he had no money to pay wages, that the farm had been producing only the basics since he had been alone, barely coping with the livestock and planting, without having to rush indoors constantly for the children. Clara replied that she wasn't asking for wages. She was asking for a roof, food, and the right to stay, as long as she was useful. She said she knew how to cook, wash, sew, tend a garden, and raise children, and that she wasn't afraid of hard work. Thomas remained silent for a while, turning the cup in his thick hands, and then nodded in that economical way Clara would learn to recognize as his way of saying everything without wasting a syllable. So the agreement was made, simple as a handshake at the farm gate, and Clara rolled up her sleeves before the sun had fully risen. The first days were of hard work and cautious silence. Clara transformed that abandoned kitchen into the heart of a home once again. She rose before everyone, lit the fire, prepared coffee with corn muffins or homemade bread, fed little Sam his oatmeal porridge made just right, and had lunch ready when Thomas returned from the fields, covered in sweat and dust. The house began to smell of people. Who care? The pots gleamed again on the wall hook. Clothes appeared, washed and folded in the cedar chests. The yard was swept. The vegetable patch, which had become overgrown, was weeded anew, and little by little, new cabbage, scallion, cilantro, and mint plants sprouted there, which Clara planted with seeds she asked from a passing farmer. Thomas observed everything with an astonishment he tried to hide. He returned from the fields to find the house transformed each day, his children clean and fed, supper steaming on the stove, and he felt a gratitude so great it sometimes hurt his chest, because gratitude, when mixed with guilt, becomes a knot difficult to untie. Guilt had lived in him since the night Sarah fell ill. It had been a fever that arrived without warning, one of those the country folk called a bad fever that carried off strong people in a matter of days. Thomas was in a distant pasture, tending a bull that had fallen into a ditch, and when he returned 2 days later, Sarah was already burning with fever in bed, her eyes glazed, her body trembling beneath 3 blankets. He rode all night to the village to fetch the doctor, but by the time they reached the farmhouse, the fever had already done its damage. Sarah lasted 2 more days, delirious, calling for the children, and died on a rainy morning with Thomas's hand squeezing hers. Lily was awake when it happened. She was 5 years old and saw everything from her bedroom door. She saw her father cry for the first time. She saw her mother stop breathing, and from that day on, the girl was no longer a child. It was precisely Lily who was the challenge Clara hadn't foreseen. The girl didn't scream, didn't throw tantrums, didn't cry. She did something worse. She ignored Clara as if she didn't exist. When Clara served her plate, Lily pushed it aside and went to eat dry flour with her hands, because dry flour was what her father used to give her. When Clara tried to comb the girl's tangled hair, she would slip away without a word and hide behind the chicken coop. When Clara tidied the room, Lily would mess everything up again and put things back in the wrong places where they had been before, as if maintaining disorder was maintaining her mother's presence. It was a silent and fierce resistance, nothing childish about it. And Clara, who had seen pain in many forms, recognized there the most dangerous pain of all, that of someone who refuses to let anything new in for fear of losing again. Clara didn't force, didn't insist with the comb, didn't compel her to eat, didn't try to hug when she wasn't wanted. She simply remained constant like the stove lit every morning, present like the smell of food at the right time, and let the girl come in her own time, if she came at all. Meanwhile, she gave little Sam the care the child had needed for months. The baby was thin, irritable, cried a lot at night with colic that kept everyone awake. Clara realized that Thomas was feeding the child pure cow's milk, too heavy for such a small creature's stomach, and changed everything. She began to dilute the milk, warm it to the perfect temperature, add a pinch of sugar and a dash of fennel tea, and the colic decreased. In 2 weeks, Sam slept through the night. In a month, he was a different baby, plump, cheerful, stretching out his arms when he saw Clara approach. Thomas saw all of this and softened internally without realizing it. He began returning from the fields earlier, not because the work had lessened, but because the house had become a place where one wanted to be again. He started talking more during meals. First about farm matters, then about the children, then about things that had no practical purpose, but filled the silence with something good. Clara listened with genuine attention, asked questions about the livestock, about the crops, about the land, and Thomas found himself explaining things with a patience he didn't know he had, almost smiling when she understood quickly. But neither of them touched on the topic that floated over the house like a rain cloud that wouldn't burst. Neither of them spoke of Sarah. The second week brought the first outside visit. Mr. Henderson, a neighboring rancher of advanced age, appeared one Wednesday afternoon mounted on a buckskin horse that had seen better days, just like its owner. He was a respected man in the region, also a widower, but of an old widowhood, one that forms a crust around the chest. He had lost his wife more than 15 years ago and never recovered, living alone in a farmhouse too big for one man, with farmhands taking care of everything, while he slowly faded in a rocking chair, surrounded by whiskey and silence. Mr. Henderson loved Thomas like a son he never had, and came occasionally to check if the young man was bearing the weight. That day he found the house different, and the girl in the kitchen, and his eyebrows rose higher than his hat when he took it off. Thomas explained the situation with few words, and Mr. Henderson listened in silence, his gaze wandering between the man, the girl, and the children, with the expression of one who has lived long enough to know that life creates tangles no one plans. The old man didn't say whether he approved or disapproved. He simply drank the coffee Clara served. He complimented the corn muffins with a grunt that was the closest he came to praise. And when it was time to leave, he pulled Thomas aside in the yard. What he said was short and direct, that the girl seemed like a good person, and that the house was better than he had seen it in months, but that the village people had already heard, because farmers carry news faster than the wind, and that Mrs. McGregor, Sarah's old friend who owned the general store in the town square, was telling anyone who would listen that Thomas had taken up with a woman before completing his wife's mourning period. Thomas felt his blood heat, but Mr. Henderson raised a hand, asking for calm, and said he wasn't there to judge, that everyone knows the pain they carry and the remedy they need, but that he should be careful, because village gossip can destroy more than a flood. That night, after Thomas had retired and the house grew dark, Clara sat on the bed in the back room with her mother's recipe notebook open on her lap. She turned the pages slowly, reading the notes written in pencil in small, slanted script. And each recipe brought with it the ghost of a memory: the orange cake of Sunday afternoons, the rice pudding of the midsummer festival, the hot milk with molasses her mother made when Clara was sick. In the middle of the notebook, between the shortbread recipe and the guava jelly one, there was a torn page. The remaining piece of paper showed it had been ripped out in a hurry, and Clara ran her finger over the ragged edge with an old sadness. It was the recipe for the birthday crumble her mother made for her, a blueberry crumble that tasted of childhood and belonging. The page had been lost in the move after her mother's death, or perhaps before. Clara never knew. She only knew that since that recipe disappeared, she had never again celebrated her birthday, because without that crumble, the date was just another empty day. She closed the notebook, put it under her pillow, and put out the kerosene lamp. It was then that she heard a sound: tiny footsteps in the hallway, light as a cat's paw. Clara lay motionless in bed, holding her breath, and heard the steps stop in the kitchen. She waited a moment and then got up slowly, walking silently to the door. What she saw squeezed her heart in a way she hadn't expected. Lily was standing in front of the kitchen window, barefoot, in a white nightgown, her face pressed against the dark glass, looking out. The girl wasn't crying, wasn't making any sound. She just stood there, staring out at the dirt road that disappeared into the darkness, waiting. Clara understood without needing explanation, because some things are understood with the heart, not the head. Lily was waiting for her mother to come back. Every night, while her father slept the heavy sleep of exhaustion, that 2-year-old girl would get up and go to the window to wait for her mother to appear on the road, because no one had managed to convince her heart that those who go beneath the earth don't return by the road above. Clara returned to her room in silence, without the girl realizing, and lay with her eyes open in the dark for a long time, feeling the weight of what she now knew. Caring for that house wasn't just about a lit stove and washed clothes. It was about healing wounds no one saw, wounds that bled in the darkness, that hurt most in those too young to understand what it means to lose forever. The weeks passed with that rhythm of routine that settles in without asking permission, and Thomas's farmhouse began to take on a look it hadn't had in a long time. Clara's garden was already bearing its first fruits. The yard was always swept. The hens began laying regularly again because they now had food at the right time, and the house smelled of food all day because Clara was one of those women who cook as if they pray, with faith that food heals what medicine cannot. Thomas worked better in the fields now that he didn't need to carry the baby strapped to his back or rush indoors at every cry. The livestock fattened. The crops promised a good harvest, and the two farmhands who came to help with the heavy work commented among themselves that the boss was looking like himself again. But if life was settling within the farm gate, on the other side, a storm was slowly brewing, like those summer rains that darken the sky little by little before suddenly pouring down. The gossip reached the village before. Clara had been on the farm for a month, and it arrived in the worst way, through the mouth of one who believes herself the guardian of others' morals. Mrs. McGregor, widow of the old store owner, and now owner herself of the business, and of all conversations that passed through it, had been Sarah's close friend, Lily's godmother, and considered herself the guardian of the deceased's memory. She was a woman of noisy faith and selective charity, one of those who pray the rosary at the church door for all to see and talk about other people's lives as if it were community service. When a farmer who had crossed paths with the girl on the road commented at the store that he had seen a young woman entering the widower's farmhouse, Mrs. McGregor felt she had received a sacred mission. She spent the entire week spreading the news with that tone of false concern that is gossip's favorite disguise, saying that poor Sarah had barely cooled in her grave and her husband already had another in her place, that the girl must be one of those who wander from farm to farm looking for a widower with land, that the children were being raised by a stranger with no family and no references. The venom spread through the village like an oil stain on water. And when Thomas appeared at the monthly market to sell cheese and buy provisions, he felt the stares before he heard the words. Women whispered behind stalls, men averted their faces when he passed, and even the baker, who always saved him fresh bread, pretended he had run out. Thomas was not a man to care about other people's tongues. He had thick skin for that kind of thing. But when he returned to the farmhouse that afternoon and saw Clara on the porch with Sam in her arms, singing a quiet lullaby while the sun gilded her face, he felt for the first time the fear that this situation might end, that outside pressure might spoil what was working inside. He didn't say anything to Clara about the market. He kept his discomfort to himself, in the way men of that time did, pushing worry beneath work, like someone burying a seed and pretending to forget it. But Mrs. McGregor was not a woman to stop at mere gossip. One Friday afternoon, as the sun was losing its strength and Clara had just put the beans to soak for the next day, the sound of an old pickup truck stopped at the farm gate, and 3 women got out with expressions of those going to a wake. Mrs. McGregor was in front, dressed in black as always, with her Bible under her arm like a war shield. Behind came 2 village acquaintances, Martha and Betty, who served more as an audience than anything else. Thomas was in the fields, and Clara was alone with the children. When she saw the 3 women cross the yard towards the house, she felt her stomach clench, but she straightened her back and went to meet them on the porch, with the dignity of one who owes nothing to no one. Mrs. McGregor didn't even wait to be invited in. She said she had come to see the children, that as Lily's godmother, she had an obligation to watch over her godchildren's well-being, and that the village people were concerned about the situation in that house. The words came out coated in honey, but the poison was in every pause, in every glance. Mrs. McGregor cast towards Clara's clothes hanging on the clothesline next to Thomas's shirts. In the way she examined the kitchen, looking for flaws, in the way she lifted Sam from the floor and inspected him as if expecting to find marks of neglect. Clara remained silent, not because she was a coward, but because she knew that a poor woman without family, fighting with a woman of position in a small village, was a lost battle before it began. She let Mrs. McGregor wander through the house. She let the acquaintances make gestures and grimaces. And when she thought the storm would pass without rain, the lightning struck. Mrs. McGregor stopped in front of Sarah's photograph on the living room wall and turned to Clara, her eyes moist with an emotion that was half real and half act. She said that this was Sarah's house, that this kitchen was Sarah's, that these children were Sarah's, and that no passing stranger had the right to occupy the place of a woman who had only been buried for a few months. Then she looked at Clara with new, lingering attention and said something that chilled her blood. She said it was curious how Clara resembled Sarah, the same kind of hair, the same way of walking, and that perhaps that's why Thomas had accepted her so quickly, because he wasn't looking for a helper, but a copy of his dead wife. The acquaintances fell silent, and the air in the living room grew heavy, like before a storm. Clara felt the words hit a place she didn't know she had, because until that moment, she hadn't noticed the resemblance Mrs. McGregor pointed out. But now, with Sarah's portrait on the wall behind her and Mrs. McGregor's poisonous gaze in front, doubt settled like a thorn that enters the flesh and breaks off inside. Lily appeared at the living room door in the midst of it all, drawn by the strange voices. And when she saw her godmother, she began to cry for the first time since Clara had arrived. It wasn't a child's cry wanting arms, it was the cry of one who recognized someone from a time that hurt. And Mrs. McGregor seized the opportunity to pick up the girl and cast Clara a look of silent triumph, as if to say that here was proof that the children needed familiar people, not a stranger. Clara felt the floor move beneath her feet, but she didn't waver outwardly. She waited for Mrs. McGregor and her acquaintances to leave. She waved goodbye from the farm gate with a steady hand, and only when the truck disappeared around the bend in the road did she lean against the wall and let her body slide to the ground, trembling all over. It wasn't anger she felt, it was something worse. It was doubt gnawing from within, asking if Mrs. McGregor wasn't right, if Thomas didn't see her as someone else's shadow, if that place truly was hers, or if she was only warming a borrowed space. When Thomas returned from the fields at the end of the afternoon and found the signs of the visit, the poorly made supper, and Clara, with red eyes she tried to hide, he didn't need much explanation to understand what had happened. He remained silent for a long time, eating without tasting, and when Clara stood up to clear the dishes, he spoke without looking at her, his voice low and careful, like someone treading dangerous ground. He said that Mrs. McGregor didn't run that farm and that Clara wasn't going anywhere. Clara stopped with her back to him, her hands gripping the edge of the sink, and asked without turning around if he wanted her there for herself or because she resembled someone else. The silence that followed was one that weighed tons. Thomas slowly put down his fork, looked at the back of the woman who had saved his home and his children, and felt a confusion in his chest he couldn't untangle. He said he had never thought about it, that for him, Clara was Clara, and Sarah was Sarah, and that if she resembled her, he hadn't noticed it. But the words came out uncertain, and Clara perceived the hesitation as if it were a blow. She finished washing the dishes in silence and retired to her room without saying goodnight. And that was the first time the two slept with distance between them, not of meters, but of unresolved matters. The following days were strange and tense, with Clara working harder than ever but speaking less than ever, and Thomas circling the house with guilt, unsure what to apologize for. He found himself looking at Sarah's photograph on the wall and then at Clara in the kitchen, comparing unintentionally, searching for the resemblance Mrs. McGregor had planted in his head, and getting angry with himself for not being able to stop. Clara noticed the glances and closed herself off even more, and the house that had begun to breathe again started to suffocate anew. Lily, with the sharp intuition that hurt children develop, felt the change in the air and became wary again, as if Mrs. McGregor's presence had reopened a wound that had just begun to heal. The girl stopped eating Clara's food again. She went back to peeling potatoes alone in the yard. She returned to long silences and hard stares. It was as if the entire house was moving backward, undoing knot by knot everything Clara had woven with such care. It was in that tense atmosphere that the longest night of that farmhouse arrived. Sam began to cough after supper, a dry cough that turned into a cold, and before midnight, it became a fever. Clara touched the child's forehead and recognized the dangerous heat she had felt many times caring for Aunt Margaret. She prepared elderberry tea, made wet cloth compresses, held the child in her arms, trying to lower his temperature with everything she knew, but the fever wouldn't break. Sam burned like an ember, his tiny body shaking with chills, his breathing coming out with a wheeze that filled the house with fear. Thomas, seeing his son in that state, felt terror climb his spine like a living thing, because that scene was an exact repetition of what had happened with Sarah. The same fever, the same trembling, the same glazed eyes. The memory returned in full, cruel, and with it came the panic of one who already knows how this story can end. Thomas grabbed his hat and said he was going to find the doctor in the village, that he wasn't going to wait until dawn, that he wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. Clara tried to argue that the road was dark and that it had rained in the afternoon, that the route would be dangerous, but she saw something in his eyes that wouldn't admit discussion. It was the desperation of a father who had already lost too much and couldn't bear to lose anything more. He saddled the horse in the dark, mounted without looking back, and disappeared down the road like a shadow swallowed by the night. Clara was left alone with the two children, the baby burning with fever in her arms, and Lily sleeping in her room, unaware of anything. The house became enormous around her, every shadow seeming larger, every sound from the woods outside seeming like a threat. And Clara prayed softly as she changed the compresses, asking God not to take anyone else from that house that had already paid too high a price in suffering. It was around 2 a.m. that the worst happened, not with Sam, who still had a fever but was stable in Clara's arms, but with Lily. The girl woke up with the sound of her brothers crying, came out of her room and into the kitchen, and what she saw shattered her world. She saw Clara holding the baby who was trembling and whimpering. She saw the wet compresses. She saw the tea on the table. She saw the kerosene lamp casting shadows on the wall, and all of that mixed in the head of a 6-year-old girl with the night her mother died. Lily's body froze in the kitchen doorway. Her eyes widened enormously, and then came the scream, a sharp, tearing scream, not of fright, but of pure terror. The terror of someone reliving the worst night of her life and unable to separate what was past from what was present. The girl began to tremble from head to toe, slid to the floor, and huddled against the wall, her arms wrapped around her knees, crying in a way that didn't seem like a child's cry, but like the lament of a wounded animal. Clara felt desperation tighten around her because she had a sick baby in one arm and a panicked girl on the floor, and she was alone in the middle of the night with no one to help her. But desperation is a luxury a mother cannot afford, and that is exactly what Clara became in that hour, without realizing it, without planning it, without asking permission. She carefully put Sam in the crib, covered the child, and knelt on the floor beside Lily. The girl huddled tighter, shrinking from contact like a cornered animal, and Clara didn't insist. She stayed there on the floor, sitting beside her, not touching her, not speaking, just present, like a warm wall protecting from the wind, demanding nothing in return, and began to sing. It was a song her mother sang on stormy nights, a simple, repetitive melody that wasn't meant to be beautiful, but to be safe, to be the same every time, to say without words that as long as that music played, nothing bad would happen. Clara sang for a long time, repeating the same song as if it were a prayer. And little by little, so slowly it was barely noticeable, Lily's body stopped trembling. Her crying diminished, her sobs became spaced out, and the girl slowly uncurled her knees from her chest. At some point that neither of them could pinpoint, Lily rested her head on Clara's shoulder. First she just rested it, light as a bird alighting, and then she let go entirely, letting the weight of her small body fall against that woman who smelled of soap and fennel. Clara stopped singing and remained still, feeling the girl's heart beat fast against her arm, and heard when Lily whispered with a voice destroyed from so much crying of a single word that changed everything between them: stay. It wasn't a request. It wasn't an order. It was surrender. It was a 6-year-old girl saying with the only word she could, that she couldn't bear to lose anyone else, that she couldn't bear to wait by the window, that if that woman left like her mother had left, she wouldn't survive again. Clara squeezed the girl against her chest and cried silently with her, because some pains only pass when one shares them with someone who understands. Dawn found the two asleep on the kitchen floor, leaning against the wall. Lily curled up in Clara's lap like a puppy that had finally found refuge. Sam slept in the crib nearby, his breathing calmer, his fever visibly lower. This is how Thomas found them when he arrived with the village doctor, almost at sunrise, soaked with rain and mud, his horse exhausted. He stopped at the kitchen door and stood looking at that scene without being able to move, because what he saw was not an employee caring for children who weren't hers. It was a mother holding his children as if they were the most precious things in the world. The doctor examined Sam, said it was a throat inflammation, that the fever would subside with the teas and compresses Clara was already making, that the girl had acted well, and that the child would be fine in a few days. Thomas thanked the doctor, paid for the visit with cheese and butter, because money was short, and when they were alone again, he looked at Clara with a clarity he hadn't felt since Sarah's death. In that moment, kneeling beside the chair where Clara was now sitting with Lily still asleep in her lap, Thomas understood that the question about resembling Sarah was the wrong question. It didn't matter if Clara resembled Sarah or anyone else in the world. What mattered was that she had stayed, that in the darkest hour, when he wasn't there, she held everything together herself. She held the house, she held the sick baby, she held the shattered girl, and that wasn't something someone who resembles another does. It was something someone who is someone does. He said nothing because he hadn't yet found the right words, but he touched Clara's hand with the tip of his calloused fingers, and she raised her tired eyes. And what passed between those two gazes carried more than any sentence could. Something changed in that farmhouse after that night, and it wasn't something that could be seen with the eyes, but it was felt in the air, like rain is felt before it falls. Thomas woke up differently the next morning, with a firmness in his gaze Clara hadn't known. A decision that seemed to have been born during the dark ride and matured upon seeing the two women of his life sleeping on the kitchen floor. He drank his coffee in silence. He looked at Lily, who for the first time in weeks sat beside Clara at the table and ate her corn muffin without complaint. He looked at Sam, who was already showing improvement in his crib with less red cheeks, and then he got up, put on his hat, and said he was going to the village to take care of some things. He didn't explain what those things were, and Clara didn't ask because she had learned that Thomas was a man who spoke with actions, not promises. What Thomas did that morning, the whole village knew before noon. He went straight to the church and sought out Father Michael, a thin man with white hair and gentle eyes, who had known Thomas since childhood and had baptized his two children, celebrated his wedding to Sarah, and committed her body to the earth. Thomas sat in the front pew of the empty church and told the father everything with the raw honesty of one who doesn't know how to sugarcoat things. He told him about Clara, about the work arrangement, about the children's improvement, about Mrs. McGregor's visit and the gossip. And he also told him, his voice lower and his hands clutching his hat in his lap, that he felt something for that woman he hadn't expected to feel again, and that he didn't know if he had the right to feel it. Father Michael listened without interruption, as men do who have learned that listening is more important than advising. And when Thomas finished, the priest remained silent for a while, looking at the altar crucifix before speaking. What the father said was simple, and Thomas carried those words for the rest of his life. He said that mourning is not a prison, and that God did not invent nostalgia to prevent anyone from living, that honoring those who are gone is not to wither alongside them, but to remain standing, caring for what remains. He said that Sarah had been a good wife and a good mother, but that she was with God, and the children were on earth needing living care, not dead homage. He said that if Clara was a good woman, and if Thomas felt in his heart what he was saying with his mouth, then he should do things properly, marry her before God and the community, and give her the respect of a wife, not the shame of a live-in helper. Thomas left the church with a lighter heart than when he entered, and went to make his second visit of the day. He stopped the pickup truck in front of Mrs. McGregor's store when business was at its peak, with half a dozen people shopping and chatting on the sidewalk. Mrs. McGregor saw him arrive and straightened herself behind the counter, ready for the confrontation she knew was coming. But what Thomas did took her by surprise. He didn't yell, he didn't accuse, he didn't threaten. He entered the store calmly, took off his hat out of politeness, and spoke loudly enough for everyone inside to hear. He said that Mrs. McGregor had been Sarah's friend, and he respected that, but that respect ended where meddling began. He said that Clara was an honorable woman who had saved his children from hunger and growing up without care, that she had done more for that family in weeks than the whole village had done in a year of his widowhood, because no one, not even Mrs. McGregor, with all the concern she claimed to have, had shown up to help when he was sinking. The silence in the store was cutting. Mrs. McGregor opened her mouth to respond, but Thomas continued. He said that he was going to marry Clara, that Father Michael already knew, and that the marriage banns would be read on Sunday, and that whoever wanted to talk could talk all they wanted because gossip never prevented a decent wedding. He said all this, looking Mrs. McGregor in the eyes with a firmness that allowed no retort, and then put his hat back on. He bought something at the counter, paid exactly, and left. The people in the store looked at each other, unsure what to say, and Mrs. McGregor, for the first time in years, was left speechless, not because she lacked words, but because deep within that chest covered with a Bible and judgment, something recognized that Thomas was right. She hadn't shown up to help. None of them had, and sometimes the truth hurts more than any offense. Thomas returned to the farmhouse in the early afternoon and found Clara in the garden, kneeling in the dirt, weeding among the cabbage plants, with Sam sitting on a blanket nearby, and Lily, for the first time, playing close to her, not next to her, but close, which was already an enormous conquest. He got out of the truck, walked to the garden, and stood looking at that scene for a moment, engraving it in his memory, because he knew he was about to change everything, and wanted to remember how it was before it changed. Clara looked up and saw something different in his face, a lightness she hadn't known, and she waited without getting up, her hands dirty with soil, and her heart racing without knowing why. Thomas knelt in front of her, right there in the garden, among the cabbage and scallion plants, with the smell of wet earth rising around them, and spoke in the only way he knew how, without embellishment, without a speech, without kneeling on the ground, as in the novels he had never read. He said he had gone to the village to speak with the father, and that he wanted to marry her if she accepted. He said he couldn't promise the world, because his world was small. It was just that farmhouse, that livestock, those children, but that he shared all of it, with an open heart. He said he knew she had arrived there asking only for supper and a roof, and that he was incapable of offering pretty words, but he could offer a surname, a real home, and the certainty that she would never again need to sleep without knowing where she would wake up. Clara looked at him with eyes full of tears and a trembling mouth, and for a long moment she said nothing, because the words were all jumbled in her throat, unable to come out in order. Then she asked, her voice breaking, if he wanted to marry her, Clara, and not the memory of someone else. Thomas understood the weight of that question and held her face in his large hands, which still had dust from the road. He looked into her brown eyes, which were not like Sarah's, because Sarah's were light, and her nose, which was not the same because Sarah's was delicate, and her mouth, which was not the same because Sarah's was smaller, and he said that he was looking at her, only her, that it was Clara who had lit the stove in his house again. It was Clara who had taught his son to sleep. It was Clara who had held his daughter on the kitchen floor when the world was falling apart, and that it was with Clara he wanted to grow old on that porch. She said yes without speaking the word, because the yes came out in a mix of tears and laughter at the same time, and Lily, who was close enough to hear everything, watched from a distance with that seriousness that was her trademark. Clara looked at the girl and extended her dirt-stained hand, without forcing, without pulling, simply offering, as she had done from the first day. Lily stood still for an instant that seemed to last all the time in the world, and then walked slowly, step by step, and took Clara's hand with her small fingers, squeezing tight. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Thomas looked at the two intertwined hands and knew that this was the missing blessing, more important than the father's, more important than the entire village's. The wedding was set for 3 weeks later. Enough time for the marriage banns and for Clara to sew a decent dress with fabric Thomas bought in the village. Father Michael read the banns on the following 2 Sundays, and no one came forward to object. Although Clara was sure Mrs. McGregor would be in the front row to raise an objection, Mrs. McGregor didn't appear at church on either Sunday, and Clara later learned from Mr. Henderson that the store owner had been silent since the day Thomas spoke to her, and that some of the acquaintances had started to change their tune, saying that after all, the widower was right, and no one had gone to help when he needed it. People are like that. my friends. They turn wherever the wind changes. And sometimes it's enough for one person to speak the truth aloud for the castle of gossip to crumble entirely. The wedding day dawned with that clear September sky that only the countryside knows, aching with beauty, with a warm wind that carried the scent of apple blossoms from the garden. The ceremony would be simple in the small village church with few guests. Mr. Henderson would be the best man for Thomas, and the wife of the oldest farmhand would be Clara's witness, because she had no family to fill that role. Clara got ready in the back room that would soon cease to be just hers. She put on her new, raw cotton dress, with delicate lace trim at the neck that she herself had embroidered at night after the children were asleep. She braided her hair with apple blossoms Lily had cut from the garden, and it was precisely that detail that made Clara cry before the ceremony. The flowers had appeared on her bed early that morning, without a note, without explanation. But Clara knew it had been Lily, because no one else woke up before the sun in that house. In the church, Thomas waited in the suit that only came out of the cedar chest for special occasions, the same one he had worn to marry Sarah, and he didn't hide it or apologize for it, because for Thomas, wearing that suit wasn't repeating the past. It was showing that life continues on the same foundations, and that this takes nothing away from anyone. When Clara entered the chapel holding a bouquet of wildflowers with Lily walking beside her, advancing with her head held high, because she had no father to give her away, but she had the dignity to walk alone, Thomas felt his eyes sting and wasn't ashamed. Father Michael officiated the ceremony with words that spoke of starting anew and of courage, of hands reaching out in the darkness and finding other hands. And when he declared them husband and wife, Lily, sitting in the first pew with Sam on her lap, did something no one in that church expected. She smiled, a small, almost invisible smile, but it was the first smile from that girl in over a year. And whoever saw it felt that something was happening there that went beyond a wedding. It was a family being stitched back together with new thread on old fabric. The celebration was at the farmhouse, with the table set in the yard under the shade of the big tree, simple and abundant food that Clara had prepared in the previous days, with the help of neighbors who had finally accepted the situation. There was celebratory roast chicken, homemade bread, baked beans, sweet buns, jam tarts, and freshly brewed coffee. The few guests ate and chatted until the sun set, and when they left, the farmhouse settled into that good silence of a home filled with peace. Clara was clearing plates in the yard when she felt someone tugging at the hem of her dress. She looked down and saw Lily with a folded piece of paper in her hand, extending it to her with the solemnity children have when they do something they consider very important. Clara knelt down and took the paper. She unfolded it slowly, and what she found made her legs weak. It was a recipe written in a child's round, uncertain hand, full of errors and ink smudges, but perfectly legible. Blueberry crumble. Clara looked at Lily, not understanding, her heart beating so fast it seemed to want to burst from her chest. And the girl explained in that rushed way of children who have much to say and little practice saying it. She recounted that she had seen Clara looking at the recipe notebook many nights, running her finger over that torn page, and that one day she asked Mrs. McGregor at the store if she knew the recipe for blueberry crumble, because Mrs. McGregor had an old recipe notebook that belonged to her mother. Mrs. McGregor, whom no one expected to help with anything, searched in her notebook. She found a similar recipe and dictated it to Lily to copy one afternoon when the girl went to the village with Thomas. The girl had kept the paper under her pillow for days, waiting for the right moment, and decided that the wedding was the moment, because a wedding is a day for gifts, and that was the gift she wanted to give. Clara held that paper like a sacred relic, and tears fell without asking permission, thick and hot, wetting her new dress and the recipe, and Lily's hands, which she squeezed between hers. It wasn't just a recipe, my friends. It was the missing bridge. It was the girl saying that she accepted Clara not as a substitute for her mother, but as someone new to love. It was the page that was missing from the notebook and from life. And it was Mrs. McGregor back in the village, with all her flaws and all her sharp tongue, showing that beneath judgment, sometimes there is a heart that knows how to do the right thing when a child asks for it. Thomas found the two embracing in the yard, Clara kneeling, holding Lily against her chest, both crying and laughing, and he knelt beside them and enveloped them in an embrace that also included Sam sleeping in the rocking chair and the memory of Sarah, who didn't need to be forgotten for life to move forward. The months that followed the wedding were of learning and tightening bonds. Clara stopped being the helper and became the true mistress of the house, the one who decided the menu, who managed the pantry, who negotiated fabric prices at the store. who advised on where to plant and when to harvest. Thomas discovered that sharing decisions was not weakness. It was intelligence, because Clara had a practical sense he admired and a courage to take risks that he alone would not have had. The farm grew in those months as it hadn't in years. They bought more chickens, expanded the garden, sold cheese at the market, with a profit that was enough to repair the roof and replace the old windows with glass panes that let the morning sun in. Sam grew strong and healthy. He became a clever child who ran after the chickens and called Clara Mummy with the naturalness of one who had never known another. Lily slowly opened up like a flower that needs time and patience, and little by little she stopped being the old child who peeled potatoes in silence to become a child again, playing in the garden, inventing stories, laughing at silly things. And one full moon night, Clara realized that Lily no longer went to the kitchen window to wait for her mother to return. The girl slept soundly through the night, and that was the greatest victory Clara achieved in that house, greater than any harvest or repair. Mr. Henderson, the neighbor who lived alone ruminating on his own widowhood, began frequenting the farmhouse more regularly after the wedding. He would come for Sunday lunch, which Clara prepared with celebratory care, and stay all afternoon on the porch, chatting with Thomas and playing with the children in a clumsy way, like someone without practice but with desire. Clara noticed that the old man was changing, that living with a living family was thawing something inside him that solitude had hardened. On one of those Sundays, Mr. Henderson confessed to Thomas, his voice thick with whiskey and emotion, that he had been wrong to lock himself in mourning for so many years, that his wife would not have wanted to see him rot alone in a house too big, and that seeing Thomas have the courage to start anew had been a slap and a lesson at the same time. Thomas said nothing. He simply refilled the old man's glass again, because in the countryside, some things are better said in shared silence than in any speech. A year and a half after the wedding, on a summer afternoon when the heat made the air shimmer over the land, Clara called Thomas to sit on the porch and told him, her hands trembling in her lap, that she was expecting a child. Thomas stood still for an instant, with the empty expression of someone receiving news, too big for his face to grasp. And then he smiled in a way Clara had never seen before, a smile that was whole, without shadow, without reservation, without any ghost behind it. He hugged her right there on the porch with the strength of someone embracing the proof that life had not given up on him. And Clara knew in the embrace of those arms that the question about resembling Sarah had died once and for all, buried by everything they had built together. The child was born the following spring, a boy they named Anthony in honor of Clara's father, whom the road had taken too soon, but whom she never forgot. Mrs. McGregor sent a gift of hand-knitted baby clothes with a short note that said only, "For the baby, with wishes for health." And Clara kept that note along with the recipe Lily had copied, because they were proof that people can change when time and truth do their work. The years passed with the swiftness that years have when life is truly lived. Sam grew up and became a hard-working young man who helped his father in the fields with Thomas's same silent dedication. Lily became a beautiful and studious young woman who learned to read with Father Michael and then taught the neighborhood children under the big tree in the yard because the village had no school, and she decided she would do it. Anthony, the youngest, grew up hearing that he had two fathers in heaven, Grandpa Logger and Aunt Sarah, who watched over the stars, and he never felt that this mended family was any less a family than any other. The farm prospered until it became the largest in the region, with good pasture, fat cattle, a garden that yielded fruit all year, and a big house, with open windows where there were always people at the table and food on the stove. Mr. Henderson spent his last years frequenting that house, as if he were a borrowed grandfather, and when he died of old age on a winter night, it was Thomas who arranged the funeral, and Clara who cooked for the wake. Because true family isn't just blood. Much later, when Thomas's hair had turned completely white, and Clara's hands already bore the marks of a lifetime of work, the two sat on the same porch where everything had been decided. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky with that orange that only the countryside knows. And the farmhouse around them was alive, with the sound of grandchildren running in the yard and the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. Lily, who was now a grown woman with her own family, had come to visit with her children. Sam was in the corral with his father, showing his eldest son how to milk a cow. Anthony sent letters from the city where he had gone to study, and in each letter came a piece of nostalgia and the promise to return. Clara looked at all of it, the house she had found dead and helped resurrect, the garden she had planted, the vegetable patch that had grown, and felt a peace so great it hurt with its beauty. Thomas took her hand as he did every afternoon on that porch, intertwining his calloused fingers with hers, and asked if she remembered the day she arrived. Clara smiled and said she remembered everything. The cold stove, the crying baby, the serious girl in the yard, and the enormous fear she felt that she would be sent back in the morning. Thomas slowly shook his head and said his fear that day was different. It was the fear of accepting help, of admitting he couldn't do it alone, of letting someone into a house he had locked up along with his pain. Clara rested her head on his shoulder and softly murmured the phrase she had spoken so many years ago. "If you let me stay, I can make supper." Thomas chuckled with that low, husky laugh of an old man who has cried all he needed to cry and now only knows how to laugh. He replied that she had done much more than supper. She had made the whole house, the whole family, the whole life. And Clara squeezed his hand and said she hadn't done it alone, that he had left the farm gate open that afternoon, and that sometimes that's all God asks of us. Not great feats, not miracles, just that we open the gate when someone needs to enter. And so ends this story, my friends, which is not about love at first sight, not about passion born in a flash and dying in a storm. It is about love built over a lit stove in the morning, in the hand that holds a child on a feverish night, in the plate set at the exact time, in the silence that says more than a speech. Thomas and Clara, what does the name matter? Because this story happens every time someone has the courage to extend a hand and someone has the courage to accept it. If this story touched your heart as it touched mine in telling it, leave your like now. Subscribe here to the Tales of Other Times channel. Activate the bell and share it with someone who needs to hear that starting over is not weakness. It is the bravest thing there is. Tell me in the comments what moment touched your heart the most. Was it Lily's scream on the kitchen floor? Was it the marriage proposal in the garden? Or was it that folded paper with the recipe the girl kept under her pillow? I want to know what stayed in your heart. And always remember, sometimes you think you're just asking for a plate of food, but God knows that what you really need is a home. Until the next story, God bless you and your home, as He blessed Thomas's and Clara's.